easier to manage in the facility. While they have a little bit higher risk to reoffend, they were amenable to treatment in a much more meaningful way a lot of times. A lot of times that's just because they have a little bit higher levels of brain development at 17 than, say, a 14-year-old does. And really this is about brain development. The story here is that there's really two periods of life where brains are massively developing, right? Between 0 and 3 or 4, your brain is having massive development, but that's mostly in the areas of learning to control your body, how to walk, talk, eat, all of those things. And then you kind of have this latency phase. And then again in adolescence, you have this kind of building the second story in your brain of development and hardwiring, where you learn about relationships, if-then thinking, the importance of getting along with others, how to view and see yourself in society. And that development really happens between 15 and 25. And so if those important brain functions are being taught inside of a correctional facility, it's important that the environment there is such that those things can be taught in a way where we don't have more antisocial teaching and learning than positive teaching and learning. And so in Oregon, we put all these kids together, and lots of people have questions about how do we do that. First of all, there's the sight and sound rules. How do we get around sight and sound? The Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention will consider a youth, even if they're tried in adult court, a juvenile, if they committed their crime before they were 18, were arraigned or officially charged before they were 18, and were sentenced or convicted before they were 20. And so we are allowed to keep those youth together and mix the population. And so we may have a 20-year-old and a 17-year-old have contact in a day, and the feds aren't concerned with that. And because they're considered juveniles, we haven't had any issues with our PREA audits as well. The next part is, what about programming, right? Programming is very different for these young people. And kind of along with that is safety. How do you maintain a 13-year-old and a 20-year-old in a facility, right? People think that and get really worried about it. And so let me give an overview of how our system works really quickly. I want to be mindful of time, just so you can kind of get a picture. So we operate 5 close custody facilities around the state, kind of regionally, and 4 transition programs. Within each closed custody facility, we have multiple pods or living units that contain or can house between 16 and 25 youth, and each one has kind of a distinct purpose and function. So we have 5 units that are certified residential level drug and alcohol substance abuse, treatment centers. 4, 5 that are specifically tuned up to do sex offender treatment. 3 that are specifically tuned up for mental health treatment. 2 that are specific intake and assessment centers. And that's really how this works. Youth come into those intake and assessment centers, and we do a battery of assessments to determine risk and need. And I'm sure you are aware, lots of research that says we don't mix risk levels. So and this is risk to reoffend, not risk to behave badly in an institution. And they're very different things. So when you mix high risk and low risk kids, you end up with all high risk. And so with the way our state is designed, we do these assessments, and then we assign youth to housing units around the state based on their risks, their needs, and their kind of age/maturity level. And so you'll end up with kind of age mates, all working on the same thing, all kind of at the same risk level. The downfall of that model is that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that means you're not going to be real close to family. And so we've implemented a lot of video visiting and some other things to accommodate for that. I do want to look at those slides on the PowerPoint that I have. I just have a couple. I like pictures. That on slide 2 is just our quick demographics of our facilities. Currently, 45% of our population in our close custody facilities are committed through the adult court, and 45 or 55% are from the juvenile court. The length of stay on those populations vary dramatically. We have paroling authority for the juvenile court kids, so as soon as we think that they can be safe, they've been rehabilitated, we have an appropriate placement for them, we can move them out. The adult court youth have determinate sentences and can stay with us until their 25th birthday, and then can be transferred on to the adult system, or until we determine that their behavior is such that we can't manage them or they're unsafe, we can transfer them to the adult system early, but not before their 18th birthday. Our average age, there was a graph there, you can see, the bulk of our youth are 16, 17, or 18 through 20. We have some outliers on either end of that. The next slide is about isolation incidents, and I was tempted to put a whole bunch of behavior slides in, but the rate of isolation is kind of a catch-all. If it takes in our state a serious threat of violence or violence occurring to be placed into isolation, and only until you can re-regulate your behavior enough to come out, or until you can be safe to come out of that room, then isolation becomes a pretty good, overall determination of how well youth are behaving, or at least being safe. And as you can see, our juvenile commitment kids are the ones that are behaving violently in the facilities more often than not. Then, our revocation kids, so a juvenile commitment that was released and then was revoked to the facility, and then our adult commit youth. So the behaviors, and for those people who run institutions, you kind of know this intuitively, that 10% of your population accounts for 90% of your problems. And if you look at that 10%, it's most frequently the youth that have emotion regulation problems that come from a mental health issue or some sort of trauma or PTSD, where they're just very reactive and they're reacting to their environment and behaving really poorly. And then there's this small little slice that are using aggression and violence as a means to an end. I like to say, the example, I want your sandwich, I'm going to take your sandwich, or you're in the wrong gang, so I need to teach you to not be in that gang. That slice of violence in our facilities is very small compared to the slice of emotional reactive youth, which surprises a lot of people. They think the adult commit kids, kids committed with, robbery with a weapon, we house youth that have aggravated murder in our facilities, that they would be the most violent kids, and they just aren't. If you flip the page over, I have the last two slides are a study we conducted internally in our own research department about what happens to youth when they leave our facilities. This is 36-month recidivism rates for youth that were sentenced as adults that either finished their sentence with us in an OIA facility or finished their sentence in an adult facility, which means they started with us and we had them transferred to the adult facility for one reason or another, or they chose to transfer, or they started in the adult facility because that's how we did things a long time ago. And so you can see the difference in recidivism. Overall, right? In Oregon, we go from 22% recidivism with those adult commit kids to 38% recidivism. But if you go to the next slide is where it kind of gets very staggering. We broke this down and said, okay, well, is it different by risk level? So if they come in and they were already a moderate to low risk youth, and when I say risk, crime severity plays into risk, but other things go into that risk factor as well, such as antisocial attitudes and beliefs, being a gang member, family history, your academic performance, age that you committed your first crime. There's many risk factors that go into that. And so if you are a high-risk youth going to the Department of Corrections, right, is on the far right of this slide, right, it's still a swing, right? We still don't get as good of outcome. But if you're not the highest of the high-risk kids, and our cutoff line here is about 75%, so the top 25% of our riskiest kids, right, we have this big swing on, but our lower three-quarters of our kids, we are increasing the recidivism by about 102% by transferring them to the adult system. And that goes back to that brain science, right? If it's about attaching and belonging and learning and doing, so, kids learn through social learning. They see what their peers are doing and they start to emulate that thing. If that's an adult prison and they start to emulate what the adult prisoners do or what happens in adult prison, that's what they're going to do when they get out. And so I'd love to answer any questions you have about how Oregon does things, and I'd love to get some advice about how to do away with our automatic waiver. With that, I'll answer questions or turn it over to the next speaker.
Before we continue, does anyone have any questions for the speaker on the phone? I do have one. Was your new system a legislative mandate, or was it implemented by the executive branch?
So it was a legislative mandate. In the early 90s, it's kind of an interesting thing. We were part of the Department of Human Services. We were a branch of the Department of Human Services, and we operated, several facilities around the state that were homes for boys, and at the time, a youth in Oregon could commit a big bad crime like murder, and there was no waiver process. So they would come to us, and we would hold them till their 21st birthday, and then they would be released. And that got the public really angry after a couple of really kind of high-profile juvenile murders in the state, and that's when Oregon passed Ballot Measure 11, which is our automatic waiver law, and it goes along with mandatory minimum sentencing for juveniles. And when that ballot measure passed, the legislature said, well, if we're going to have all of these kids coming in, how are we going to handle them? And took us out of Human Services, created our own agency, and in that bill that created us, said this is how you're going to do it. And so since our inception, we've been doing it this way. And again, we freaked out because we thought we were going to have these really hard kids, not realizing we had those kids before. They were just under a different jurisdiction. And it took us about 6 months to realize, oh, wait a second, this is the same kid we had before. They just stay longer. So it was an interesting transition time for us.
Madam Chair, Senator Goycochea.
Go ahead.
Yes, just a question for the presenter. What kind of security do you have at these facilities? And, as I look at your PowerPoint, clearly you assess all the individuals coming through the system as to their risk factors. So, and again, you have some that are high risk that are held at your OYA facilities. What kind of security do you have at these facilities? Is it fence security, or, I happen to represent NYTC and CO Bastion in my district, as well as a number of adult facilities, but those are pretty much open campuses. So I was just curious, what kind of security do you have?
That's a very good question. We have a range of security depending on the risk level of the youth. Our most secure campus is our McLaren campus in Woodburn, Oregon. It is a fully secure campus, fenced. It's got the 20-foot curved fencing that no climb, sally ports, the whole deal. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have a work-study program, which is unlocked. The youth are, even Department of Corrections kids, when they hit kind of their last 6 months or 8 months, are allowed to go there. And if they meet risk level clearances, and those guys leave the facility in the daytime and they do work crew in the community, and they give back and learn work skills, vocation opportunities, and at some point even do unsupervised work in the community, kind of like work relief, and come back at night. And so we kind of run the gamut, but we definitely have facilities that are fully secure.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I do have one other question. Your staffing ratio, I know it's different at the different facilities, but could you speak a little bit about your staffing ratio of staff to number of youth in the different facilities?
All of our facilities are considered youth correction facilities, and so we are required to meet the PREA staffing ratio. And I don't have that on the top of my head. I believe it's 1 to 8 swing shift. I know it's 1 to 17 on the overnight. I can't remember what the day shift number is. I think it's also 1 to 8, but I'm not positive.
Thank you.
Holly Welborn, Policy Director for ACLU of Nevada. The ratios, PREA's ratios, are 1 to 8 during day hours and 1 to 16 during sleeping hours.
Thank you. That's right. It's 1 to 17. When we hit our 17th kid, we're having a problem.
Thank you so much for joining us and for the presentation.
Thank you, and any of you are welcome to come see Oregon anytime you'd like.
We may take you up on that.
Good morning. My name is Jennifer Redman, and I'm superintendent at Greenhill School, which is a roughly 180-bed juvenile facility in Washington State under the Rehabilitation Administration, juvenile rehabilitation, which is under the Department of Social and Health Services umbrella. For the sake of time, I'm not going to repeat a lot of what my peer in Oregon said, but essentially Washington State is following the same model and a similar trend in how we got to the place where we're at today. In the late 90s, we had a model similar to what you all, I believe, have today, where our young people who had received adult sentences were in a Department of Corrections facility, a specific identified Department of Correction facility, separate wing, and that was for a few years. We unfortunately received some threats of litigation and things of that nature associated with not being able to meet the required educational requirements for those young people at that facility, as well as some of the things that Holly has been speaking about. So what we ended up doing was moving to an agreement with our Department of Corrections in Washington State, as well as some legislation to support it that would allow those young people to be housed in our juvenile facilities. Initially, it was just at Greenhill School, which is our highest security facility where I am at currently, and they would remain there for the entire duration of their adult commitment until they needed to transfer the Department of Corrections if their adult sentence went beyond age 21. Our jurisdiction ends at age 21 for our juveniles in Washington State. As time went on with the research around adolescent brain development and really wanting to just reduce any contact with the adult system for any young people, even those serving adult sentences, we had kind of expanded that legislation to where if they have an adult sentence that ends prior to age 21, which happens for about half of our adult sentence youth, and we have approximately 64 in our system today out of 500 youth in our state system in total. If their sentences to end prior to age 21, they can actually access our entire continuum of care in Washington State. So that includes starting out at my facility, Greenhill School, which is maximum medium security facility, fenced, Sallyport, just as Oregon had described. But then they have the ability to transition to our youth camp, which is an 80-bed facility, not fenced, but the living units are secured, it's staff secured, or out to one of our 8 community facilities, which are minimum security facilities where they can go to public schools or alternative schools, hold jobs out in the community, unsupervised. I mean, there's kind of supervision plans with their employers, but they have access to the community with quite regularity, and that's towards the later part of their sentence, so it helps transition them back out to the community. And that services for our juvenile sentence youth as well. So full integration. There's really no difference in services between those in our system that are serving adult sentences and juvenile sentences, and I wouldn't even know the difference if I looked at them on my campus. The programs that we offer are dialectical behavior therapy, cultural programs. We have an on-campus high school at my facility. They go to several periods throughout the day, intermixed with juvenile sentence youth. We have a few different units on our campus to match to the specific needs of the youth, if they're acute mental health youth or a more mature, graduated, more vocation-focused young person. We kind of try to separate them out based on needs and program needs, as well as social service needs, mental health or substance abuse, things of that nature. We also take into account maturity and age, similar to what Oregon does. So in Washington State, we have 3 institutions, mine being for the 16 to 21-year-old males, and we have Echo Glen Children's Center, which is a smaller facility, approximately 120 beds. It doesn't have a fence, but it does have maximum security capability units on campus, and our female population would go there and female adult population would go there and start their sentence, and if their sentence ends prior to age 21, they too would be able to go out to a community facility in order for us to provide gender-responsive programming for our females. Trying to think what else. Trying not to repeat. I think in general, Oregon best described as far as the behaviors. The behaviors are no different than the juvenile behaviors in our facility, and quite frankly, our youth serving juvenile sentences are probably showing more behaviors. And I'm not sure why. I don't know if it's our adult sentence youth tend to be with us a little bit longer, and so they mature. And in a sense, we've found that they've actually stabilized our institution a little bit. We do have an agreement with the Department of Corrections, similar to Oregon, where should we find ourselves in a situation where a young person who's serving an adult sentence is not on board with treatment and presenting high-risk behaviors behaviorally, whether it's assaultive behavior that's beyond what we can manage, and we try to manage it to the extent that we can. It's our goal not to transfer any adult sentenced youth to the Department of Corrections prior to age 21. But should we need to, we have that agreement with the Department of Corrections to do so after age 18. I think that's about it. Yeah. Any questions for me?
Madam Chair, Senator Goycochea.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ma'am, I just want to make sure I've got this correct. It does sound like, though, that especially the 16 to 21-year-old or 18 to 21-year-old offenders, then when you take those in, they do go to your I'm going to call it a full lockdown facility until you do the assessment on them. And then it sounds like at this, I think you said 500 bed unit, or then you do an assessment on them, see how they're fitting in, and what the risk is, and then you would in fact send them out to other facilities, depending on their risk level and where you thought. And I guess what I'm looking at is very similar to what I guess we have to say we do here in probably county jail, and then we look at it and we think, okay, this particular, and I'm going to call him student offender, call him what you want, but would work at, say, CO Bastion or at NYTC. NYTC clearly is for the, in Nevada is, the higher risk offenders, but we would send them there, or to CO Bastion, which is even a co-ed facility. So again, it sounds to me like you're doing something very similar. What we're lacking is this intake facility that would provide some security and do that assessment.
Yeah, so to clarify, unlike Oregon, we don't have an intake and assessment center. We only have 500 youth in our system, and that includes our youth, the 60, roughly 60, 64 that are serving adult sentences. So we don't have the facility space to dedicate one facility to intake and assessment. So what ends up happening is youth who receive an adult sentence per statute and per our agreement with the Department of Corrections, they actually go to a Department of Corrections facility that does have an intake and assessment facility, but they're literally there for about a day just because of the sight and sound separation issues. They go there, they receive Department of Corrections classification because they are under an adult sentence, and the Department of Corrections is actually still responsible for the determination of their release. And we have a Department of Corrections classification counselor who also has a space on my campus who continues to keep tabs on those young people while they're with us, even after they go through the intake process with the Department of Corrections. So they come to us after that one day getting classified at a Department of Corrections facility, and then they go through our battery of assessment, screens and assessments, just as our juvenile sentence youth do. And that happens just through an intake process. And that intake process is the same at every single one of our facilities because we do have youth that go straight from juvenile courts. They get their sentence and they go to one of our 3 main institutions. It just so happens the adults, the youth serving adult sentences, with the exception of the females, come straight to Green Hill School from the Department of Corrections facility first because we are a fenced facility, a higher security level. And they're there for the early part of their adult sentence. The only ones that can move on beyond Green Hill School are those that have an adult release date prior to age 21. If they have an adult release date that extends beyond age 21, then we keep them the entire time. So their entire sentence is prior to age 21 is with us, and that could be anywhere from 3 years to 4 years. And so we do pretty robust programming around academic treatment as well as on-campus employment, vocational skills, certifications, things like that, because that is a long time for a young person to be at one facility. And then we transition them onto a Department of Corrections facility for the remainder of their sentence. Half of those, half of the 45 that we have on our campus, through kind of our risk assessment process, similar to what Oregon does, can eventually, probably after they spend a year with us at Green Hill School, transition to our youth camp, where they're off doing Department of Natural Resource types of activities, providing fire suppression support for some of the fires that happened in Washington State, partnering with a Department of Corrections work crew, and then eventually to a community facility where they're accessing the community with regularity. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, ma'am. Just to follow up, if I may, Madam Chair. But you said your facility, I believe, is a full lockdown facility, or at least completely secure.
Yeah, it's a fenced facility for 180 youth, and it's controlled ingress, egress, and youth are escorted across campus with staff. Yeah.
Thank you. Any
other questions? I have a few. the community facilities that you spoke about, the transitions, could you just tell me a little bit more? How many do you have, and how do you determine where they're located? And is the youth try to find a facility close to their home neighborhood? How is that decided?
Yeah, so we have 8 community facilities, and they're across the state of Washington. We have about, I think, 5 on the east side and 3 on the west side. And they average anywhere from 12 beds to 16 beds apiece. They, as far as how youth are placed there, we have a couple people who go out to all of our institutions, well, 3 of our institutions, and review casework, interview the youth several times, and really get to know the youth to determine what community facility best matches their treatment need. And part of that decision includes, does it make sense for that young person to go back near the community by which they came from, or does it make sense for them not to? And it's unique for every youth, especially our real gang-involved youth. There's some youth that are well in agreement of, I want to go to the east side of Washington State because my gang is over on the west side, and I want to, be in an area that I know I'm safe. I can go to school and gain the skills, and we have youth that eventually end up just doing independent living on the east side in order to, get out of that particular lifestyle. So it's a case-by-case basis. So the goal is to regionalize as much as possible, especially so we can involve family with treatment, but we also do video conferencing, things like that, a lot of visitation. We, through our community facilities, also offer community involvement passes where youth can go home for a weekend with their families, with some vetting. There's a home inspection type of situation that occurs prior to that, and it's a privilege, and so they have to earn that privilege. But we do those types of activities as well for those young people in our community facilities.
And just last 2 questions. Quickly, you had spoke about cultural programs. Could you tell us a little bit more about what the cultural programs are that you offer? In your female population, are you noticing a rise in your female population? And how did you handle housing that population?
Yeah, so the cultural programs, and I'll speak to Greenhill School. We probably have the most robust cultural programs from the 3 institutions, and largely because we have youth that are with us longer and they're older. We have contracts. I have contracts with some outside providers for specific cultural groups. So an African American cultural group, Pacific Islander cultural group, Native American cultural group with a local tribal member, and a Latino cultural group. The groups essentially are an opportunity for youth to learn more about their cultures, their cultural identity, and where they came from. And it helps them learn, that, especially those that are gang involved, that there's more about me than my gang. I have this other family, this is where I came from. They learn about their values within their culture, and it really helps kind of curb the gang behavior to an extent and kind of identify a different family. We do a powwow once a year. We have a sweat lodge on campus to meet the spiritual needs of our Native youth. We have African American cultural celebrations. A lot of different activities that we do just to kind of meet the cultural needs of our youth, because it's a very diverse population and we don't want to treat them as all the same. Did that answer your question about the cultural programs?
It did. And are all the youth invited to participate so they learn more about each other's culture?
They are. I would be lying to say it tends to be just that culture, but it's open invitation. And we do have some youth, because maybe they don't look like those youth. They may have grown up in a culture that does look like those youth. So we do open invitation. For our female population, I'm trying to remember your question, they all go to Echo Glen Children's Center, and we have a unit that is specific for all females, so we can make sure that we're providing them gender-responsive treatment within that unit. But they integrate with our male population at school and other kind of campus activities. The difference is typically our female population, by the time they come to our system, because they haven't been able to be kept locally successfully, they've probably kind of been through a lot of local sanctions and diversion opportunities and things like that. By the time we get them, they're about age 16 or older. So they are housed with our younger male population, so 12 to 15-year-old at Echo Glen. So we don't have, same age boys and girls typically at one institution, because they are young people and they find things to do. So it does help us manage that pretty well. And the girls, since they're there until age 21, they do provide a sense of stability for our younger males who are often more immature and things like that. They take more of a leadership role. As far as rise, we have about 30 females in our system right now, and that's not high. We've had more than that. We've had a little of an uptick over the past few months. We were down closer to about 25, 24, but in general, we're fairly low. We have a community facility for girls that I believe is funded for 12 beds, and it's always operated under capacity at about 9 or 10. And then we have our living unit on campus at Echo Glen Children's Center. Unfortunately, with our female population, typically when we receive them from county programs, they're acute mentally ill, a lot of self-harm behavior, a lot of exposure to trauma. And so Echo Glen Children's Center, it's got pretty robust, psychological services, medical services, things like that, in order to help get them healthy so that then they can transition out to the community facility, which is our ultimate goal. We do have, I believe, as of today, 1 or 2 females that are serving adult sentences in our system, and they are currently at Echo Glen Children's Center. And the same rules apply just as our males. If their release date is prior to age 21, then they can serve the later part of their sentence at the community facility for females. Otherwise, they would transition to a female Department of Corrections institution at age 21.
Thank you. See no other questions?
Just one, Madam Chair, Senator Goycochea. I was just curious with that last statement she made. I would think it would probably be problematic if you had a male or female, but if they realized at age 21 they were just going to go to an adult facility and there was no way to, gain any ground, whether they be at your facility or a community-based facility, it looks like they'd be a lot harder to deal with. Do you find that?
Not so much. A lot of times the young people kind of see it as a gift. They see it as a gift that they've been able to spend as much time possible in a juvenile facility and participate in age-appropriate programs and kind of benefit from that, because they do acknowledge and realize early on that they're not going to get that in an adult facility. So they really maximize getting vocational certifications, their high school diploma, age-appropriate treatment, things like that. Do they get short timers or the fatalistic attitude because they know they're going to eventually transition? I mean, we work with them on that with our treatment model, but ultimately they try to maximize their time with us as long as possible, and they see it as a gift. Not all of them, but most of them really do. And fortunately, with our partnership with the Department of Corrections and good relationship, we have that one classification case manager person who serves at all the institutions, but they're predominantly stationed at mine. Some of the conversations that person has with these young people is your behavior here in the juvenile department can dictate your placement in the Department of Corrections. So they take into account good behavior and treatment, involvement and things like that. That's all credited towards their stay at a Department of Corrections facility, so that it can impact their ultimate classification as to where they go, because there's different levels of security in our Department of Corrections facilities. They can be more likely to go to a work camp of some sort after they finish with us, as opposed to a higher secure facility where they would have less opportunities for those things. Also, since Department of Corrections is in charge of their release date, their behavior with us impacts their good time. So, and the youth know that.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thank you, ma'am.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. I hope that those presentations were enlightening. I think, again, this is the beginning of a conversation. I want to quickly summarize some of the conclusions and findings from our facilities tours, and I want to publicly thank the administrators from Warden Baker at Lovelock Correctional Center, Jack Martin, Frank Cervantes, Ms. Duffy, I'm forgetting a lot of people, that were very transparent throughout this process, that welcomed us, let us in some instances speak to some of the juveniles that are living in those facilities. It really helped to enhance our understanding so we can move forward with solutions and models that look like the models that we heard about today. I think I spent enough time on Lovelock Correctional Center, plus you're having a presentation from them today, but I do want to state our conclusions. We did not tour Florence McClure facility because it's the only female facility in the Nevada Department of Corrections, but we did not tour that facility for a simple reason. They simply do not have any accommodations for young female inmates at this time. I think that's really our most pressing problem that needs to be addressed pretty immediately, whether that's through regulation, through contract. There's nowhere to house young women that are tried as adults. We know of 2 young women, potentially 3, potentially 4, but one was transferred out of state. Another juvenile, I don't believe she's been sentenced yet, but I believe that there's been an agreement for that individual to stay in either a local or state facility. But really the default policy for young women is placing them in segregation or sending them out of state. And there have been cases filed, sex discrimination lawsuits filed in the state of Wyoming and in Tennessee, claiming that because there are no options available to those young women, that it's a violation of their rights. So I think that is a pressing concern that the state and our administrators and the DOC really, and the DOC is aware of that. They reject segregation as an option. There were some conversations about putting a portable unit on the campus of Florence McClure to house the young women, and they'd essentially live in isolation for the duration of their time, which could be as long as 3 years, and it's just simply unacceptable. As far as local adult facilities, I think we need to put CCDC in a different category. First, Parr Boulevard and Elko jails, they're simply just not equipped. They do not have enough interaction with young people, which is a good thing, that we're not sending a lot of people to those facilities. They're either staying in the local juvenile facilities or just the certification process or direct file process. They're just not doing it as often because their population is so small. But when we talked to Parr, it seemed like Parr Boulevard understood the policies and procedures in PREA and what was required of them. Elko seemed to have a misunderstanding of PREA and a misunderstanding of what what it actually means when a child is adjudicated as an adult, because they haven't had a kid in their facility since 2012 when sight and sound separation was enhanced. So their understanding was that once they are certified as an adult, they are an adult under the law. So we had long conversations with them about that and some clarification. I spoke to the sheriff, and he seemed to understand that, was very open and receptive. We'll continue to work on those policies with them. But if a child does come into those facilities, they are placed in segregation, and we have no idea how long they will be in segregation. They're placed in the infirmary. They don't really have any programming. The yards are insufficient. They're just simply not an appropriate place for a child. CCDC. We were really impressed with the educational programming and other programming at the Clark County Detention Center. And we say that as the ACLU. We don't always give a lot of compliments to CCDC. But we were very impressed with the principal, not just as an educator, but he seemed to have a genuine interest in the kids that he was working with. He also had a lot of questions about, the boys in Lovelock, and wondering if any of, his former students, how they were doing, and wanted to know, how they were being housed. They're programmed the entire day. They have access to a teacher the entire day. So we're pleased with that programming. And really, our criticisms of CCDC is the facility as a whole. The yards are, that concrete chain link fence ceiling design. They've had issues with their private contractors for food and medical care. And of course, if it's not suitable for an adult, it's not suitable for a child. Juvenile facilities, we'll lump them. We went to Jan Evans, we went to DJJS, the Pecos Boulevard facility, and I also went out to Elko, went to their juvenile facility. They operate very much the same. I think Mr. Martin's facility, the county should give him an appropriation to get some construction, fix floors and fixtures and things like that. But if there aren't any dangerous conditions, the culture of the mindset of our juvenile administrators is appropriate, evidence-based. Kids get programming all day. And of course, because they're juvenile facilities, they're meeting those minimum standards, and in a lot of ways exceeding those standards. So our conclusion is those facilities would be more appropriate for juveniles across the board. We also toured Summit View. Summit View, no state juvenile facilities actually house certified youth tried as adults. But we toured Summit View because it had been proposed as a potential alternative location in the past. So we did an assessment. Summit View, we don't like that punitive design with the fencing, and but that's a philosophical argument that we can continue having, and more of a best practices inquiry than what we were looking for. But as a whole, the facility does meet the needs of kids. We wish that they had more family interaction. But they do provide, some family interaction, picnics, and visitation in certain circumstances. So with that, those major conclusions are, we really need to look at where we're placing our youth. We really need to look at how other states are applying this. And our primary recommendation, is to adopt a model similar to what Washington State and Oregon have. That's a contract with the Nevada Department of Corrections where they're paying to house some youth in these different facilities. We completely recognize that this is going to be a dramatic shift, and it will probably take a very long time to actually develop this programming, but it is our goal to start this conversation now and to see where it will lead us, and to see what opportunities we have in the future. So another proposal, leading up to that would be if we could have a study, some sort of, needs assessment study, looking at the amount of bed space in facilities, looking at what it would actually cost our local and state facilities to take on a project like this and overhaul their programming. So that way we're taking every stakeholder's thoughts into account. But we appreciate you for having us here today, and if you don't have any questions for me, that will conclude our conversation. I will say we did. We have the PowerPoint, which is quite detailed, but we published our report on our findings, youth in confinement. It was published on our website. There's copies available to the public. I brought copies for the committee. It's very detailed and provides more insight on our findings and recommendations, and as well as the history of this issue.